Welcome back. So in this section, we're going to think a little bit more about the ways that changes in ideas about science, the scientific method, and the development of medicine in the 18th century helped to reinforce some of the structures that were critical to European empire, and particularly ideas about race and labor. And so fundamentally, 18th century scientific methods built upon the Baconian tradition, going back to Francis Bacon in the early 17th century, that really emphasized privileged experience and privileged experimentation and observation, that empiricism, that you could perceive things that you could perceive, that you could test, and that the theories of the humors, the things that came from ancient texts, were less valuable than active experimentation that has gone on to become the root of what we think of as the scientific method today. So that had its roots in the early 17th century, but it was building up through the foundation, for example, of the Royal Society, particularly in English context here I'm talking, of course, and it comes to fruition with this observational methodology that begins to test certain theories. Now, we see this beginning to seep into medicine. It doesn't happen as quickly as it does into some other scientific disciplines, but it begins to seep into medicine. One of the most evocative places that we can see it is with the development of smallpox inoculation, right? So by the late 17th century, people are figuring out that injecting very small amounts of the smallpox into people allows their body to combat that and develop an immunity that means that they won't get the fully fledged development of smallpox. But this idea that is developed through scientific testing and observation cuts against, of course, all of the humoral theories, and it conceptualizes the smallpox as a thing to which one can gain immunity, not as a problem of balance, not as a problem of sort of readjusting the human body. So it cuts against a lot of this, and so this becomes a big issue, particularly across Europe, and it comes to America too, right? It has this impact, particularly in terms of American history. We see this most evocatively in 1721 in Boston, where the city becomes really divided over whether the practice of inoculation should be allowed to continue, should be allowed to happen. Because, of course, if you inoculate somebody and then they do actually get the fully fledged smallpox, then they become, they're likely to die, for example, and they're also likely to become contagious and spread the smallpox. So there's this perception that this is actually increasing risk and increasing danger to the population. And so there's a lot of pushback against this theory, against the scientific method of smallpox inoculation, and it leads to actually kind of really major civil disorder in Boston in 1721. But it takes a long time. As a good example of the way that this process is very slow, it takes a long time for the smallpox inoculation to be considered acceptable amongst most people. In fact, in some research that I have done on Dartmouth in the American Revolution, we still see a battle over smallpox inoculation that's happening in Hanover in the midst of the American Revolution, when there is a massive bout of smallpox. So basically, the scientific method of medicine that leads to things like smallpox inoculation takes a long time to filter through. It does, however, have implications for how Europeans conceive of other diseases that they encounter in New World environments and in tropical environments. So they begin to theorize, as they do with the smallpox, that it's a thing that you can, it's a particularly isolatable disease that you can inoculate somebody against. They conceptualize diseases like yellow fever and malaria as particular diseases. The framework of seeing these things as not simply, and so the 17th century terms that you would come across, things like agues or gripes or various that are basically that are related to the symptoms rather than to isolating a particular disease as a certain set of pathogens. But increasingly in the 18th century, you're conceptualizing these things as diseases, and Europeans are thinking about certain diseases as tropical diseases, right? So it's in Barbados in this period in the early 18th century that people begin to recognize that there's probably a connection here between yellow fever and Africa, right? That this is a disease that has its origins in Africa. And so they begin to trace these things through observational methods of science, and that becomes the framework for understanding it. So that on one level is all well and good, but that has implications for how you explain and understand how people are dying from things. So while Europeans are thinking about this in terms of seasoning and coming to terms with this, and that everybody, all different types of humanity, are essentially the same, but they're seasoned, their humors are balanced in slightly different ways. The theory should be, right, that Africans, just as much as Europeans, struggle with these New World diseases, but they come to the realization that Africans are not struggling with yellow fever in the same way that Europeans are in the New World. So you can see this Charleston Dr. John Linning in 1748 observing that there seems to be something very singular in the constitution of the Negroes, which renders them not liable to this fever. He means yellow fever. So here then we have an idea that Africans maybe are different, and that it is something specific to them as a race that makes them less immune, less likely to fall victim to yellow fever or to malaria. And this is where you start to see in the 18th century the development of ideas about polygenesis. Now, polygenesis here means the idea that there are multiple origin points for humanity, that not all of humanity evolves from one sort of single Adam and Eve figure, and that they go in different directions, but that they're actually distinct, almost distinct species, right? Distinct subspecies of humans, and that they have different origins, and that therefore races are not simply different hues of a same common origin, but that they are distinct. And we see this emerging initially with medical writers, people sort of marginal medical writers like this ship's physician John Atkins in the early 18th century. But by the time you get to the second half of the 18th century, the famous Jamaican scholar and historian Edward Long, who is an avid proponent of pro-slavery positions, writes a lengthy history of Jamaica in which he really kind of pushes some of these ideas of polygenesis, that Africans are a different species, and so therefore they have, of course, different immunities to different diseases. And so understanding people's immunity to epidemic disease helps to frame conceptions of races as being different. And so until you get to the image that you get behind me, that you see behind this slide from the 1850s, where you finally reach the sort of height of scientific racism, and you're understanding humanity as being divided up into all sorts of different sub-races that are immutable and that are distinct. Now that, of course, then feeds into justifying perpetual slavery and plantation labor, that Africans are more suited to certain kinds of labor, that different races are suited to different sorts of treatment, that they have different mental capacities and so forth. So the point here being that a lot of this emerges out of the thinking about epidemic disease and understand and trying to explain and understand epidemics and diseases that Europeans encounter in the New World, and particularly in the Caribbean and the lower South colonies in the English case, that this theorization of race as fixed categories emerges as part of that medical research and part of that effort to understand disease. It also, as I note there, has positive impacts, right, for Europeans. Conceptualizing race in these ways has positive implications for Europeans, because it means that their weakness and their susceptibility to these diseases is not necessarily a quote-unquote weakness, but is a reflection of their being a different species, and that their adaptation to the New World, their creolization, is of a different order. So by creolizing, by becoming Carolinian, by becoming Jamaican, they are not actually becoming more like Africans. They are actually just adapting as Europeans. The Africans are a totally different category. So it makes colonization safe. It defines race in rigid categories that facilitates and that prevents the opportunities for racial, for the idea of enslaved people gaining rights. It justifies their labor, and it all arises out of this thinking about epidemics and particular diseases. Ultimately, it also then changes the character of European empires, particularly in the Caribbean in the second half of the 18th century. Because once Europeans conceptualize these places as places where Africans have the immunity to be able to work, and Europeans don't necessarily, you actually see greater amounts of flight out of the Caribbean. So by the mid-18th century, the Caribbean colonies are seeing increasingly large numbers of absentee planters, people who acquire an estate, build it up for a few years, and then leave it with an overseer or with somebody to manage, and then go back to England. And so in contrast to the 13 mainland colonies of North America, the Caribbean colonies become overwhelmingly African. For example, when you get to somewhere like the small English island of Antigua, you have got a ratio of 10 enslaved people to every one white English person or white British person on the island by the middle of the 18th century. So this flight from Jamaica, from Antigua, from these places, and then increasingly also, as I know here from the ceded islands, the new islands that the English acquire after the 7 Years' War in the 1760s, when they acquire a bunch of different islands, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, those places are settled by planters who never really intend to come to those islands. They always see the empire as being something that, and the tropical empire as being something distinct that is not suitable to English colonization. And so in these senses, then, epidemics change their conception of where Europeans can go, what kinds of labor are suitable to them, and how they deal with other groups of people and other nationalities. Of course, on the flip side of that is a space for what I'm calling here subaltern medicines, right, and agencies. The idea that actually the majority of medicine that ends up being practiced in the Caribbean is based upon indigenous and African pharmacologies. So even though Europeans come in and do all these experiments and employ all this scientific method in trying to understand yellow fever, there is a huge gap between that discipline of medicine amongst colonial doctors and the reality of pharmacology that goes on with potions, with plants, with medicinal effects, the rituals and ceremonies that go into sacred medicine amongst indigenous and African populations. That is facilitated in many respects by the fact that the Caribbean becomes this space, unlike maybe the 13 North American colonies in the English case, where people are mixing a variety of different African traditions partly because of the huge demographic of the effect that the gruesome nature of slavery and the way that it works people to death. Caribbean colonies are always dependent upon new influxes of enslaved Africans, which means you've got a mixture of all sorts of different kinds of African traditions with new importations of people from different parts of Africa. And because these islands are right next to each other, French islands, English islands, Spanish possessions like Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo, that all of these places see people move from one empire to another, bringing knowledge, circulating knowledge. And Gomez, as in the reading that you will do, outlines how these processes take place and how these people move around and are able to move around the Caribbean, the circum-Caribbean, the larger Caribbean, so the islands, but also the coastline that surrounds it, and how they transfer this knowledge, and how they become the critical vector for medical knowledge in this world. They are the experts for on-the-ground medicine, for dealing with these issues and for transferring this knowledge from person to person. Now, where certain forms of healing prove effective, of course, white doctors will come in and appropriate that knowledge, and often in medical treatises sort of say, well, we discovered this, and my slave showed me this, but basically that I tested it, and by my testing it, putting it through the scientific method, I quote unquote discovered it. But that there are actually these circulations that the people on the ground, and even planters themselves on the ground, recognize that if you need something, you need to solve a medical problem, you need to deal with an epidemic, then many of these African and indigenous medical practitioners are better capable of doing this. And Europeans by this point in the 18th century are beginning to frame this in terms of like European quote-unquote rational medicine, and these quote-unquote folk traditions that combine the spiritual and the medicinal, that seem to kind of cross this boundary and believe in sort of what look like religious practices as much as medicine. What we have to remember, of course, in that is that Europeans themselves had also been engaging in those sorts of practices until 50, 100 years before. In fact, in many places, and particularly in sort of areas like New England, there is still a belief in the combination of spirituality and medicine, right? People like Cotton Mather, the famous New England minister, saying that sin is at the root of all disease, and that that any disease is really a punishment from God, that particularly indigenous people falling prey to European diseases are falling prey to them because of sin and because of God's judgment. So the way in which the divine is mixed with the medicinal is certainly not something that marks off indigenous and African people in this time. But Europeans are increasingly trying to make that distinction in order to justify their own knowledge here. And we see the patterns and processes of this, and hopefully you'll see some of these through the reading from Gomez that you have for this class. And think about, as you look at that, what factors shape the transmission of these subaltern forms of medical knowledge around the Caribbean. What facilitates it? What hinders it? How are these people able to move between empires, between islands around these spaces? Also think methodologically about the kinds of sources that Gomez uses. How is he using sources that are not supposed to reveal these processes, that are supposed to hide, in fact, the realities of indigenous medical and religious practice, and condemn those things, but he's using them to tease out what those patterns and processes are. So think about how Gomez uses those sources, what the strengths and weaknesses of that approach is, and then think about the extent to which these subaltern medical traditions are really important to colonial life in the Americas, right? Are we simply privileging this to try to balance out our traditional story of European medicine and European evolution of medical knowledge, and saying, well, these other people had other medical knowledge? Or does this have foundational agency in constructing the Caribbean world, in how people understood the experience of living and dying, the majority of the population being enslaved Africans? How did they, what kind of history do we recover if we recover a history that is a history of the people that they trusted to do medicine? And what kind of story of epidemic disease in the Caribbean and in English and in European America do we recover if we tell that story? So as you think about Gomez, think about those questions too. So here we've seen the contrast then between the evolution of what's happening in European medicine in this time and what's happening in the 18th century and the 17th and 18th century in the medicine and medical practices of subaltern peoples. And so in the last section, we will move on to think about the 19th century and the way that these things are slightly shifted by the improving medical knowledge of Europeans and their more full belief in their own ability to not only diagnose these problems, but solve them.